All right, my name is Tyler Brosell. I'm taking computer security in the spring of 2024, almost said fall. And my project is on the Morris worm. Okay, and first we're going to go over some background. Um, this took place in the 80s, I think 1988 in November, I believe, if I remember the date, um, how I believe it is. Um, and during this time, it was Robert Tappan Morris is the guy I'm going to talk about, and a program he created, which we now know as the Morris worm, or it's also known as the Great Worm. This topic is very prevalent in computer securities, and computer security system uh, generally, as before his time, it wasn't really taken as seriously in the 80s. It was more so that people believed the internet was kind of a place where people shared everything, and it was quite open. And a lot of the modern security systems we see was not around during this time. So there's going to be some things I talk about, which if you think about today's, going to sound crazy, and a lot of times it won't even let you do the stuff that it won't even let you do anything that Robert Tappan Morris used to exploit some of these systems, especially with the passwords. Um, and I'm going to generally talk about some general background information on Robert Tappan Morris, and the kind of computer systems that were around during that time and the vulnerabilities that happened. In this presentation, I'm going to talk about how the Morris worm spread, why it was created, and the four main methods that were used, and with some of those methods, the exploits that Robert Tappan Morris used in order to spread this worm, and ultimately what went wrong with this worm and the aftermath this worm caused. Um, I first want to talk about the state of the internet in 1988, because it's very different than we think of it now, and compared to nowadays, where the internet is millions, if not billions, of devices connected together, creating this thing we all know and love. It was about 60,000 computers, give or take. There's no definitive like number, but that's a good rough estimate. And during this time, most computers were the same models and were running the same operating systems, which meant that if someone like Robert Tappan Morris found a vulnerability in these systems, he knew this vulnerability would work on the majority of these computers. I think there was two main computers being ran. One was Sun 3, um, and I can't remember the off the top of my head the other one. He had two different versions of this worm, one for the Sun 3 and one for the other operating system and model computer that was mainly prevalent. And during this time, most normal people didn't own computers. It was mainly universities, government facilities, and things of that ilk, um, which meant that a lot of the trust and um, security systems we now know today wasn't as prevalent because it was mainly a system of people are going to help each other during the internet, as they were all kind of, universities or government facilities. There wasn't much, um, no one really was that malicious on the internet before this worm happened, which meant that it caused the secure the security systems were pretty lackluster, if existent at all, or even cared about at all during this time. Um, and so that pretty sums up the internet in 1988. It was small, um, not as we know it today. Security was next to none, um, and it was basically just universities and government facilities using these, not that much personal computers, as they were very expensive, and it was a pretty insular community at this time. So like I said earlier, Robert Tappan Morris is the guy I'm going to be talking about. I believe when he created this worm, he was a student at either Cornell or Cambridge. I want to say it was Cornell. Um, and his idea, at least what he said to the press, was he wanted to spread this worm to see how big the internet was. How true is this claim? I don't know. It seemed like it could be true, but Robert Tevin Morris also hacked into MIT to send out this worm, so he knew at least at some point he didn't want it directly linked to him. So he knew at least somewhere along the lines it wasn't a right thing to do, even if it was just to map out the internet. And we'll see this a little bit later with some countermeasures he put up just in case people are defending from the worm. So this is going to show exactly how he wanted this worm to function in order to map out the internet. So first, he's going to send off that worm to a computer. I'll get into the methods of how he would do this later in the presentation. Once this person right here gets the worm, that person will use the same methods I'll describe later to spread it first. But first, they're going to put a flag up on their system saying that they have the worm, denoted by this little flag with the worm. And then they're going to send it to other devices they can connect to. Those people are going to put the flags up as well. And then it's just going to continue spreading. And this person is going to send a worm back. Because they might be connected and before they weren't. But you might notice this person has a flag up. So a way to Robert Tappan Morris got around not bombarding people's computers with worms, like you try to send a worm, it notices, oh, there's a flag up, you can't send that. So the worm will not be sent. And then once a certain point or time elapsed, I don't remember exactly how he would decide it was the end, some metadata, maybe enough computers were infected, are going to be sent back, maybe through a track of similar worms, or I think he may have, I don't remember exactly if he had a backdoor or some way the metadata is getting sent back to him, but it should hopefully then send a map eventually back to him, so he can look at it and see how big the internet was. Unfortunately, the worm did not go this way. If it did, I would not be talking about it right now. So in my next slide, I'm going to talk about what exactly went wrong. So the problem that occurred is first, everything went as normal. He sent the worm to his first victim, they sent off, and it's going to continue spreading. What actually occurs when he tries to send the worm back to someone with a flag. See, Robert Tappan Morris was worried that someone may try to mitigate or not get around having this worm by putting up a false flag. So saying they have the worm in their system, but they don't actually have the worm. So what he decided to do was run a probability check, which is going to see, it sees the flag. It's going to roll basically a die, 1 in 7 times, even if the user or computer has the worm flag up, it's going to send the worm anyway. Just in case, this way, hopefully he thought that if people had the flag up, it will somehow still get infected, and he thought this number was going to be big enough to not just bombard people with worms. And unfortunately, Robert Tappan Morris was not correct in this hypothesis. And what exactly happened is people were connected to a lot of different sources. More than this is just a basically hyperbole of what happened. So this person's connected to the internet. He doesn't have the worm yet. He's connected to a whole bunch of different devices that do. And all these devices are now going to start pinging. And this is just a correction. I have it this way in the presentation because it's easier to explain. It was a 1 in 7 chance for the worm after a certain point to self-destruct. To not, and 1 in 7 times it did not. I find it easier to just say 1 in 7 chance to send it out because it's easier to visualize. And this is a visual presentation. So let's say each of these people have a 1 in 7 chance to send the worm, and he's connected to 100 devices, and every single time these people get a worm, they're going to ping out to other devices they're connected to. So once this person gets a worm, he's going to ping out to all these different devices. They're going to ping back to him. But this is what it might look like to one computer. This is also hyperbole. This is not exactly, but eventually people did get thousands of worms. So he gets worms sent, and they're just going to continue getting sent. The computer will be fine running 1, 2, 3, maybe 100 of these. But what ended up happening is that The 1 in 7 probability was not big enough to stop thousands of worms being sent on computers at the same time. And what this led to, once this person has this many worms, the computer's processing power is all going to run the program of duplicating this worm, trying to basically spread it and do all the processes the worm has, which is not going to leave any more room for the computer to do any of its other processes it should or may do to even like run itself. So what ended up happening is not literally, but the system would crash, it would break. Um, and this actually caused about 10% of the internet at the time to either disconnect themselves from the internet completely to avoid getting the worm, or just crashing the systems themselves by them getting so much worms and the computer processes could not handle it. Which, like I said earlier, the internet was about 60,000 computers, so this was about 6,000 computers. In 1988, computers were not cheap, so if it ended up breaking any of these computers, it was extremely expensive. So this worm could have caused a lot of damage. It caused NASA and a whole bunch of other government agencies to stop using the internet, which could have caused some problems and frustrations, because at this point in time, some people's jobs relied on the internet, even back in the infancy, and it just made other people's lives harder. And another problem is people eventually discovered workarounds for the worm, but people disconnected from the internet, so they didn't know how exactly to get the workarounds from the worm. So basically came people calling a giant game of telephone to how to work around the worm, because if they were afraid if they turned back on their computer, they would get infected. And this happened for about 2 days. The worm was very prevalent and causing havoc on the internet. And this was really the first Trojan virus or anything of the sort. This is a worm. To go rampant on the internet. And so I'm going to talk about one of the 4 reasons this happened. This is an exploit. I'm showing this one first because we actually went over something very similar in class. So there was a process that could be run called finger, which was a daemon that was ran. So a user, such as this cool user 123 that is trying to send the worm, would on a server, it would do the finger. This should be lowercase, but autocorrect kept uppercasing it. It would write finger, a person's username in a host example, and it would check if this username existed. If the username existed, it would return general info. This would be like, are they logged in at the moment? Because this command was used if, say, you worked in a pretty big government building that had IT, and you wanted to know if someone was in. Instead of going down to their office, you can just write finger, I don't know, John Doe, and it would tell you if John Doe has logged in at all that day. It could also tell you the geographic location and a couple other information, but this is not what's important. What is important is that when you run the finger command, it would reserve 512 bytes for a username. If you wrote past that 512 bytes, it would just overwrite other information. And it wouldn't delete it. It would just let it go into the stack, basically. And we might notice this can be used as a buffer overflow attack, which is exactly what Robert Tappan Morris did. So what Robert Tappan Morris did, he had a 512 byte username, which was just no ops. It was actually just nothing. And a 24-byte attack, which was pretty small. Very precise, and it did what it needed to do. These 24 bytes contained a special return address that it would return basically the code to execute bin shell 00, which would open a socket on the server. And once this was ran, he would finger attack this, like the username, and then this byte at the end. This byte would get ran by the processor, just like we did in lab. It would open a shell on a socket. And right as that was opened, the cool user, the socket opens, the worm now sends commands directly into shell, basically having remote shell access to the computer. And with this, a copy of the worm is sent over into that socket, and if Robert could have got full access to the machine, he did not. Instead, he sends a worm over to then see if there's any other computers that he can maybe finger attack as well, or do some of the other attacks we'll talk about in a second. Which a very common way, especially if he got into one computer using maybe the finger daemon, he can use RSH, which is a remote shell, and remote execute, REXEC. First, I'm going to talk about REXEC, or RESEC. Oh, my mic fell. RESEC is a process that was going to be used first, and then remote shell will have been used on like trusted computers. So back then, computers had like trust levels, so you can say like maybe if you're a university and you have multiple computers on campus, you can trust the other computers, so that way if they wanted to like shell into your computer, they don't have to like log in every time and be like a big hassle. Like I said, computer security wasn't a big problem back then. So if you didn't have trust, you can try the he did the RESEC command, which he would basically try to log in as the computer and guess passwords. And examples of these passwords were null, because during this time you can literally just have nothing as a password, and it was quite common. The username of the server, the username twice, the username backwards, and he also used some metadata. He was able to look at like some of the metadata to find out if the user had a nickname, if the user had a first and last name, and he'd use those as well. And he also used a dictionary of, in this time, this was all Unix-based systems. Unix had a dictionary built in. He would iterate through that. And then he also had about 412 of his own written words added, which included like password. It was kind of sloppy. There was a lot of words that didn't make sense to be passwords. I think he had a couple of misspellings in this dictionary as well, which is interesting. But this actually dictionary never got fully utilized, as it took about 4 weeks to iterate through, and like I said earlier, this worm got stopped in 2. And once he guessed a password or fingered into there, he can use RSH, or remote shell, on a trusted computer. So a victim got taken over, has a worm. All these computers that he's connected to, he can literally just send the worm out because he's trusted. It's not going to ask any questions. Most of the time, sometimes people did have securities put up to prevent people from doing it. They need to log in again. But for the most part, back in this time, they didn't really care. It was just open if they were trusted. So he can just send the worms out, which seems crazy today, but was how it worked back then. And the final method that was used was a kind of predecessor to email called sendmail. And sendmail, you can set up on a mode, maybe if you're on vacation or just didn't want it to get sent to a mailbox, you can set up to like a daemon to like automatically respond. It would just be in the background, and it would listen to TCP connections, which meant, and a small vulnerability in this system was that if you sent a debug flag, you're able to run code after that debug flag as shell. So, yeah, he would run an attack as with he'd put a debug flag up if they're running Sailmail the Daemon on, and basically send the worm right over onto that sendmail, because it's just running in the background. So it would just run that code, and then it would be able to send mail to other daemons or get access to that computer, and then do any of the other vulnerabilities to any other computers it's on the network. So like I said, the aftermath, 10% of the internet was destroyed. Mass disconnections happened. It was pretty much anarchy during the internet during this time. This was the very first time the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was ever used in the United States of America. Robert Tappan Morris was charged with felony like fraud and computing acting. He was charged to probation, and he was also fined. Fortunately or unfortunately, as you might see, Robert had a very illustrious career after this. It kind of put him on the map. He knew a lot about computer security. He definitely knew about systems. So people didn't really see he had a pretty good career. He went around. But this was the very first time people really started taking computer security seriously. The ironic thing about this at the time, when Tappan Morris, sorry, um, Robert Tappan Morris, set this out, his father was, or at one point was, a computer security director for the NSA. So he's been around computers his life, and his dad was a computer security director. And during this time, computer security was not well, as we saw. But this caused a mass shift in the internet and basically put computer security on the map. As without this, I'm sure something similar would have happened, and maybe it would have been worse because it would have been more malicious. But it essentially opened the floodgates and allowed people to realize, whoa, maybe we should, take better care of our systems and keep our information private. Um, and then there is my sources. Thank you.